Good evening. There were two things that I had resolved to do as soon as I was ensconced in my new home in Thurso, and neither of them were starting a family. The two things were that I needed to find myself a job and I needed to pass my driving test. Finding myself a job wasn't very tricky. There were two high schools to hand, as it were, one in Thurso and the other in Wick. Thurso didn't have a vacancy for a teacher of maths or physics at that time, but Wick did. I think it was probably cover for a maternity leave or something like that. So I got myself a job there quickly. When I told my newfound friends in Thurso that I was going to work in Wick, I was a bit surprised at the cool reception that news received. In fact, one of the people actually said, "Oh, you'll not understand the Wickers." I thought, how foolish. I can understand the people of Thurso. The Highland accent is very attractive and not difficult to follow if you're English at all. Little did I know that the Thurso accent is very different. I also discovered the reason for the cool reception. Although the two towns are actually quite close together, not much further apart than Derby and Nottingham, the two towns are not, as it were, well inclined towards one another, or at least they were not those years ago. I never really understood the reason, but I did evolve a theory. I think it was to do with economics. Neither of the towns had ever been prosperous at the same time. For years and years, Thurso did well from sheep farming and wool. But when the Midlands and the big cotton mills started to be popular and take over, it was the fishing industry in Wick that was bringing in the money. And when the fishing industry faded, because mostly much regulation of where you could fish and how much you could fish, it was Thurso that became prosperous, because it was about that time that the Atomic Energy Authority built Dounreay there. I don't know how things are now, but I do know that there was a sort of frosty relationship. When I went to Wick High School, I was a bit sorry to discover that whoever had said I would find the Wick accent hard to follow was right. The Wick accent was derived from the countries of the north, the other fishing countries, the Scandinavian countries, Norway. And it was only then that it began to dawn on me that the gloom that I mentioned, the all-pervading gloom of that first week of journey to Thurso, was because Thurso is nearer to the Arctic Circle than it is to London, and for the winter months there is little, if any, daylight. And in the summertime, when I was there, they still had a cricket match on the summer solstice because it never really got dark. I was welcomed into the staff room and officially became a member of the teaching fraternity at Wick High School when I was presented with a tawse. You may not be familiar with what a tawse is. I certainly wasn't. It's a leather objet on a strap, and the leather is in several thongs, and the idea is that you keep discipline, if necessary, by whacking a pupil with it. I was appalled, and I am pleased to say that in the time that I spent at Wick High School, which was not as great as I intended, I never, ever used it. The language was difficult for me, not so difficult for the pupils, because they were used to hearing English voices on the radio. Though every time I said the word graph, I was teased and the pupils chuckled, and I'm sorry to say that didn't stop when I came to the Midlands. The long A for grass and graph, which are part of my diction, has never gone away, in spite of having now lived many more years north of Watford Gap than I ever lived before it. One day I was about to take the register, and that was a pretty boring activity because so many of the names in the register were the same. Monroe, 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 and occasionally Sinclair. There were one or two other names, of course. Monroe was the name historically of the peasantry. Sinclair was the name historically of those that were more well off. We had a new girl join the class, and her surname was McPhee, and I didn't understand why she was not made welcome by the rest of the pupils. In fact, it seemed to me that they avoided her, which was very strange because she was a very charming, outgoing, sunny girl. I didn't know until someone explained to me that the name McPhee in that part of the world is associated with the Tinkers, and the Tinkers were deemed to be idlers who weren't very honest. I am delighted to say that the sunny nature that she displayed and her own personality quite quickly worked through that prejudice. So I'm about to start a lesson and it's after break and one of the pupils is not there. And I said to his mate, "What's happened to Andy?" or whatever his name actually was. And the friend said, "Och, Will, he's picked his finger on a bird and he's croning." He's picked his pinky on a bird means he has stung his hand, or pinky finger, on a thistle, and his cowning meant he was crying. I know that now. I didn't know that then, but I gathered from the reaction of some of the class that I ought to be sympathetic, and from some of the class that I ought to be annoyed because he was late. So, I had a job. All I had to do now was to pass my driving test. I had had driving lessons when I was teaching in St Neots from a driving school, so I wasn't completely hopeless behind the wheel. One of the places where I could, in the evening, practice driving was a vast open space that was near the atomic energy station. It was the bus park. And if anyone had any doubt that living near a nuclear reactor could be deemed to be dangerous, you only had to see the buses, enough buses to take every member of the staff on the site away at a moment's notice, to realise the enormity of the things that could go wrong. The buses were there all day and every day, and the drivers were in them all the time. But in the early evening, when most of the staff had gone home, the car park was pretty empty. And that's when I could practice my driving. Taking a driving test in Thurso was not really as unpredictable as it might be in any other town, because there was only, for instance, one crossroads where there was a halt sign on the road. There was only one place where there were traffic lights. There was no lane driving at all, and I don't actually remember that there were any roundabouts. You would think I would manage to pass my test, but I didn't actually pass it until the third attempt, although interestingly I only failed my test once. How can that be? Well, it was like this. On the first occasion, I'm in the car, I'm taking my test, I think everything's going quite smoothly, and I'm about to drive over the main bridge into Thurso. And there, standing in the middle of the road, was a policeman who lifted his hand and put his palm towards me, and I thought he was just giving a friendly gesture. There was hardly any traffic about that day, and so, being me, I gestured fondly back and drove straight past. Only then did it occur to me that although there was hardly any traffic, there were rather a lot of people on the side of the road. And why? Because a large black limousine sporting a very heraldic-looking little flag on the bonnet came driving past me. The Queen Mother owned the Castle of May and had chosen that day and that time to arrive in Thurso over the bridge. Nobody said anything much until the end of the test, when my tester said that I had failed my test because I had not obeyed an official instruction to halt from the police. I would have done had I realised it was an official instruction to halt. The second occasion, when I tried again to pass my test, was when I was indeed very pregnant, and therefore rather large. The test was going quite well again, until the tester said to me, in a conversational manner, "Was my baby due soon?" And I said, ingenuously, "Oh, about a fortnight ago." At which point the tester took the immediate decision to abandon the test on health and safety grounds, because to attempt an emergency stop was not recommended under the circumstances. So you see, I didn't pass that test, but I didn't fail it either. I had achieved nearly both of my objectives, and I'll tell you about what happened thereafter when I speak to you again. Bye-bye.